The ocean north of Norway was a void of sound. No waves, no birds, just the hiss of the Arctic current against hull steel. In that darkness, USS Seawolf moved at 5 knots, its reactor whispering like a heart afraid to beat. It was late winter, 1976, midway through Operation Holy Stone, and every man aboard understood the stakes. Their mission was simple to explain and impossible to execute. Follow a Soviet missile submarine through its patrol zone without ever being seen, heard, or imagined. Holy Stone wasn't a single operation, but a secret religion. Beginning in the late 1960s, the U.S. Navy had turned its most advanced attack submarines into spies, silent witnesses that crept along Soviet coasts, photographing propellers, recording acoustic signatures, and mapping launch zones. Officially, these were special reconnaissance patrols. Unofficially, they were trespassing at the bottom of the world. Commander Robert J. Bob Marsh guided Seawolf under the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, the naval choke point Soviet boomers used to reach open ocean. His sonar men called it the hallway. Dozens of Soviet Yankee and Delta-class boats crossed it monthly, each carrying nuclear warheads enough to vaporize a continent. The Americans shadowed them to know which captains were cautious and which were reckless. Knowledge was deterrence. Ignorance was suicide. Inside the control room, red lights washed over sweating faces. The temperature stayed constant, but fear added its own heat. Contact bearing 084, range 5,000 yards, whispered sonar. The sound pattern was distinct. Low frequency, steady rhythm, a Soviet delta. Marsh gave a single order: trail him. Trailing meant matching speed and depth perfectly, like a mirror made of noise. Too close and cavitation bubbles from your own propeller would betray you. Too far, and you'd lose the contact. The men called it dancing in the dark. Seawolf followed for 18 hours. Twice the Soviet sub changed depth to test for pursuers. Twice Marsh matched him flawlessly. At dawn, though no one saw it, the American sub slipped into the shadow of the Barents Shelf. Above them, ice hummed with pressure cracks. Below, the continental slope dropped to 5,000 feet. Somewhere beyond the curve of the Earth, Moscow slept peacefully, assuming its deterrent fleet was safe. It wasn't. The Americans could track each missile carrier from port to patrol to return. But Holy Stone wasn't just about listening. It was about understanding. Every acoustic trace sent to Pearl Harbor's Sound Surveillance Center added to a vast catalog of voice prints. Each submarine had its own sonic fingerprint: the frequency of its turbines, the vibration of its hull plates, even the rhythm of its crew drills. Analysts nicknamed them songs. By 1977, the U.S. could identify most Soviet subs by ear before satellites ever saw them. The Soviets knew something was wrong. Their ballistic boats were being met too precisely by NATO aircraft, their patrol patterns anticipated. In Moscow, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov slammed a fist on a chart of the Norwegian Sea. "They hear us," he said, "and we don't hear them." To fight silence, the USSR built monsters. The Northern Fleet commissioned Project 671N RTM Victor III attack submarines. Faster, deeper, bristling with new towed sonar arrays designed to sniff out American shadows. The Soviet Navy also established the Ocean Surveillance Directorate, which began laying hydrophone lines along its own coasts. In secret memos, this project was called Volna Zashchiti, Wave of Protection. By 1978, the Soviet counterintelligence community had entered the water. KGB Director Yuri Andropov authorized special naval teams under the 8th Main Directorate to monitor foreign submarines acoustically and magnetically. They planted sensors near key fjords, hoping to detect the minute magnetic disturbances caused by passing American hulls. The plan was ambitious, the technology primitive, but paranoia fueled innovation. Holy Stone continued. USS Pintado, USS Kavala, and USS Parche rotated patrols through the Norwegian and Barents Seas, each bringing back reels of data and blurry periscope photographs of Soviet propeller guards and sonar domes. One officer recalled, "You'd surface just enough to take a picture, then dive before the wave finished breaking. We lived by inches." The intelligence payoff was extraordinary. For the first time, the U.S. could map Soviet missile launch readiness in real time. Naval intelligence learned that most Yankee-class subs transmitted coded status bursts via low-frequency radio every 4 hours, a discovery that later fed into satellite interception programs. Holy Stone had turned the ocean into a wiretap. In response, the Soviets unleashed their own predators. The K-324, part of the Victor III Fleet, was tasked with hunting hunters. Its orders: shadow any unidentified contact in the Norwegian trench, and if possible, photograph it. In October 1983, it snagged an American surveillance towed array, part of the U.S. SOSUS network, on its propeller. The incident exposed how deeply both navies had invaded each other's acoustic space. Western press called it a fishing accident. Those who knew laughed without humor. By the late 1970s, the underwater spy war had become a mirror of the one on land, each side pretending discovery would equal escalation, each side hoping the other would blink first. But the ocean offered no borders, no embassies, and no witnesses. A single miscalculation, a sonar echo misread as a torpedo, could ignite the apocalypse. For sailors like Marsh, the tension turned spiritual. "You start to think of the sea as alive," he later told an interviewer. "It listens back. You tap the hull, and it answers." The ocean became the third participant in the Cold War, a neutral judge that remembered every vibration. By the end of 1979, Holy Stone's data had reshaped U.S. naval strategy. The Navy could now predict where Soviet missile subs would surface for satellite uplinks, allowing American attack boats to position themselves invisibly nearby. Every success, though, deepened Soviet paranoia. Gorshkov ordered double patrols, tighter communication silence, and full-time KGB liaisons aboard ballistic submarines. The underwater spy war was now symmetrical, both sides stalking, both listening, neither blinking. The line between espionage and warfare blurred until only pressure and darkness remained. And somewhere beneath that silence, new machines waited, ones built not to fight, but to know. By 1980, the Soviet Navy had become a nation beneath the sea. Admiral Gorshkov's blue water dream had materialized into something close to religion. Vast bases carved into Arctic rock, permafrost caverns filled with missiles, and fleets that never surfaced during daylight. But the Americans still knew too much. Each time a Yankee or Delta-class submarine left its pier at Gadjievo or Petropavlovsk, a U.S. shadow followed. Each time a Soviet sub reported ready status, analysts in Maryland already had the audio tape. The humiliation gnawed at the Kremlin. At a meeting of the General Staff in early 1981, Gorshkov stood in silence before a map peppered with red and blue markers, every one of them a suspected U.S. submarine patrol. "They are listening to our heartbeat," he said. "We must stop the bleeding." The counteroffensive began with paranoia disguised as science. Soviet engineers and KGB officers launched Project Medusa, a network of underwater sensors and magnetic anomaly detectors meant to expose foreign intruders. Anchored across the approaches to Murmansk and the White Sea, These devices formed an invisible minefield of sound. When they detected the magnetic shadow of a passing hull, they triggered coded radio pings to shore. The system was crude, unreliable, and full of false alarms. Whales, debris, even icebergs. But it changed the psychology of the Northern Fleet. For the first time, Soviet submariners felt watched by their own side. To complement Medusa, the KGB established special control units aboard key submarines. These were political officers trained in counterintelligence, equal parts commissar, spy, and priest. Their mission: prevent leaks, monitor crew behavior, and report any signs of acoustic compromise. Sailors joked darkly that the KGB had put microphones inside the microphones. On the American side, Operation Holy Stone adapted to this new paranoia. Missions became shorter, data collection more surgical. USS Parche carried experimental towed arrays capable of passively mapping entire patrol zones from 40 miles away. The technology was brilliant, but unstable. The longer the array, the greater the risk of entanglement or detection. In one unreported 1982 patrol, a trailing cable snapped, vanishing into Soviet waters. The loss cost millions and forced a public cover story about classified equipment testing. Even without mishaps, Holy Stone patrols exacted a human toll. Crews spent up to 90 days submerged, oxygen recycled, bodies pale from artificial light. One officer described the experience as living inside a heartbeat that never stops. Every sound mattered. The click of a wrench could feel like a confession. The Soviets exploited this fragility. Naval psychologists, guided by KGB analysts, began training captains in acoustic deception. Crews learned to alter propeller speeds, mimic background noises, and transmit deliberate anomalies, a kind of sonic camouflage. Some submarines even played loops of whale calls to confuse NATO hydrophones. Western analysts called the new Soviet tactic maskirovka akusticheskaya, acoustic masquerade. It was the first time deception had gone fully subsonic. Meanwhile, Soviet research institutes worked feverishly on quiet propulsion. The Victor III class was redesigned with an enclosed propeller shroud, a massive ring that reduced noise by 30 decibels. When U.S. sonar first encountered the new design in 1982, operators panicked. The sub was almost silent. The Pentagon called it the ghost that learned to whisper. American intelligence responded by deploying USS Kavala and USS Seawolf equipped with upgraded BQQ-5D sonar capable of capturing ultra-low frequencies. The rivalry now resembled an arms race in sound rather than steel. Each advance in silence demanded an equal advance in hearing. But espionage is a two-way current. The KGB's Naval Directorate had quietly been sending its own special-purpose submarines to gather intelligence on NATO exercises. The uniform-class deep divers, small and heavily shielded, carried cameras and eavesdropping devices. Operating in the Norwegian and Baltic Seas, they photographed undersea communication cables and occasionally retrieved fragments of U.S. sonar buoys for analysis. Western intelligence often mistook these missions for salvage operations. They weren't. They were mirror images of Holy Stone. In late 1983, one of these Soviet special-purpose subs suffered a mechanical failure near the Lofoten Trench. U.S. surveillance satellites tracked the subsequent rescue flotilla, but neither side ever acknowledged the loss. Norwegian fishermen later found wreckage bearing Cyrillic serial numbers, which disappeared into NATO custody. The KGB filed it as equipment recovery. Another silence added to the pile. Inside the Kremlin, the frustration deepened. Gorshkov, aging but defiant, argued that the only true defense was presence. He commissioned the Typhoon class, the largest submarines ever built, double-hulled and designed to survive even a direct hit. To Western observers, the Typhoons were deterrents. To Soviet insiders, they were monuments to fear. Their very size made them untrackable in shallow, coastal waters, yet their noise was their signature. "Let them listen," one Soviet admiral said, "and tremble." By the mid-1980s, the sea had become an archive of hidden confrontations. American and Soviet submarines shadowed each other so often that collisions became almost routine. In 1983 alone, at least 4 acoustic contacts were logged by NATO that matched later Soviet damage reports. None were acknowledged publicly. The silence of diplomacy was louder than the noise of impact. Still, each incident taught both sides something. The Americans learned that Soviet sonar doctrine relied heavily on narrow-band frequencies, making them vulnerable to wide-band interference. The Soviets discovered that U.S. nuclear subs could operate for weeks without surfacing, giving them a surveillance reach that satellites couldn't match. The race to perfect the unheard became a contest of endurance rather than firepower. Underwater, it felt personal. "We were never more than a few kilometers apart," recalled a Soviet sonar chief years later. "Sometimes I thought I could hear their breathing." Holy Stone evolved again. By 1986, USS Parcha had undergone extensive refits to include digital recorders and satellite uplink antennas hidden inside her sail. She could transmit encrypted sonar packets in near real time, turning the abyss into a live feed for analysts half a world away. The technology was breathtaking, the risk astronomical. One false signal, one burst transmission too close to Soviet waters, could have exposed everything. That same year, Ronald Pelton's betrayal of Ivy Bells made Moscow believe more holy stones might exist. KGB officers scoured archives, interrogating naval officers, engineers, and signal operators. Suspicion became policy. Soviet submariners began turning off all radio communication during patrols, relying solely on prearranged timing signals. The Navy had gone mute to defend its secrets, a Navy deaf to itself. By the end of the decade, both sides realized they'd built a self-perpetuating machine. Secrecy feeding fear, fear feeding technology, technology feeding more secrecy. The Cold War's underwater front no longer needed war to sustain itself. It was an ecosystem, quiet, relentless, invisible. For the men who served beneath the surface, it was a paradox of loyalty. They'd risked annihilation to prevent it. They'd built empires of silence to preserve the illusion of peace. When asked what it felt like to win, one American sonar operator paused before answering. "Win?" he said. "We didn't win anything. We just didn't die." When the Cold War began to thaw on land, the ocean didn't notice. Down there, the missions never stopped. Even as Reagan and Gorbachev smiled for cameras in Geneva, submarines from both nations still moved silently through the Norwegian Sea, recording, stalking, listening. The sea was neutral, but it had no concept of peace. By 1987, Operation Holy Stone had become a ghost of its former self, renamed, compartmentalized, and shrouded behind bureaucratic code names like Special Reconnaissance Patrols. The missions continued, but no one outside a handful of admirals even knew the term anymore. The U.S. Navy had become a professional eavesdropper, its submarines acting as mobile intelligence platforms rather than predators. The USS Parche, under Captain J.R. Riku, Red Harris, was the queen of this invisible chessboard. Outwardly, she was a worn Los Angeles-class sub. Inside, she was a cathedral of recording gear. Parche's crew joked that she could Here a snowflake hit the ice shelf. Her refits included high-fidelity hydrophones, magnetic anomaly sensors, and even an extendable manipulator arm to retrieve fragments of lost Soviet gear. She didn't need to fight. She existed to prove the Americans already knew everything. Her Soviet counterpart, the K-278 Komsomolets, embodied the opposite philosophy: speed, depth, survivability. The titanium-hulled prototype could dive deeper than any Western submarine. Its purpose was psychological, proof that the USSR still owned the deep. When it was launched in 1983, Western analysts called it a cathedral of paranoia. When it sank 6 years later, they called it prophecy. But before tragedy, there was escalation. Soviet naval intelligence doubled down on countermeasures. The Hydroacoustic Barriers Project deployed thousands of seabed microphones along choke points, like the Greenland-Iceland Gap and the Barents Shelf. The goal wasn't detection, it was deterrence. They wanted the Americans to know they were being listened to, even when the sensors were silent. One Soviet engineer described it as whispering back to the enemy. In Washington, the shift toward arms control forced an uncomfortable reckoning. Senators wanted transparency, admirals wanted silence. When one congressional committee requested details on unacknowledged reconnaissance patrols, the Navy sent back 43 pages of blacked-out text. The summary read only, "Program continues." Beneath this paper trail, the human cost accumulated quietly. Sailors who'd served on Holy Stone boats returned home with nervous systems frayed by stress and claustrophobia. Some described feeling disoriented on land, unable to sleep without the low hum of turbines. A few spoke to journalists in vague metaphors. We stared into the abyss until it looked back. But most said nothing. They were men built for silence, and peace didn't suit them. Across the ocean, Soviet submariners suffered their own kind of fallout. Decades of secrecy had created a culture of fear so total that even success felt like failure. Officers were promoted 1 month and investigated the next. Some retired into obscurity, others drowned with their boats. When K-219 exploded in 1986 and Komsomolets burned in 1989, the official causes were technical. Unofficially, the blame fell on a system that had taught men to hide everything, even their alarms. In early 1989, as perestroika loosened Moscow's grip, a few Soviet naval officers proposed a bold idea: mutual acoustic mapping. The plan called for both nations to share data on ocean temperature layers and sonar propagation. Not weapons, just water. It was an act of almost insane optimism. A retired admiral at the meeting reportedly laughed. "You want to tell them where we hide?" The proposal died the same day. The Berlin Wall fell, but the sea remained divided by old ghosts. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, its submarine fleet scattered across new borders like wreckage. Some rusted in Arctic ports, others vanished into new navies. Many of the men who had once hunted each other now met at veterans' conferences, shaking hands across memories that didn't officially exist. In 1993, the U.S. Navy quietly declassified fragments of Operation Holy Stone. The documents were anticlimactic. Phrases like environmental survey, navigation tracking, and acoustic research. The real stories stayed buried under the ice. A few journalists dug deeper, uncovering transcripts of sonar logs and maintenance records that hinted at shadow wars no one had admitted to. One report concluded bluntly, at least 14 instances of mutual contact with foreign submarines between 1972 and 1987. Mutual contact, bureaucratic poetry for almost died. By the mid-1990s, both nations had begun collaborating on joint rescue exercises. It was a kind of exorcism, Divers and engineers from two former enemies testing shared escape pods and emergency beacons. At one of these drills in Norway, a Russian officer reportedly raised a glass to his American counterpart and said, "To the ones we didn't meet." The American nodded, "And the ones we almost did." For historians, the legacy of the underwater spy war is a paradox. It represents both the height of technological achievement and the depth of human insecurity. The data gathered during Holy Stone helped create modern oceanographic models, improved civilian navigation systems, and even influenced early internet cable protection strategies. Yet all of it began with fear, the primal dread of not knowing what moved beneath you. In military circles, the psychological toll became a case study. Naval academies taught it as the cost of vigilance. The idea was that endless observation corrodes perspective, that to live underwater for too long is to start seeing the enemy everywhere. When a retired sonar analyst was asked what he'd learned, he answered, "That silence isn't peace, it's pressure." Today, the legacy survives in hardware and habit. The U.S. Navy's latest Virginia-class submarines carry classified sensor suites descended directly from Holy Stone experiments. Russian special-purpose submarines like Losharik continue to operate in the same shadow zones once haunted by Seawolf and Parch. The ocean still hums with surveillance. Only the flags have faded. And yet, for all the billions spent and risks taken, the ultimate lesson remains painfully human. Every mission, every act of espionage, every risk of nuclear war boiled down to one desperate instinct: to know before being known. Knowledge in the Cold War was survival. In 2007, at a naval symposium in Monterey, a retired commander who had once served aboard Parche was asked to summarize his experience in one sentence. He thought for a moment, then said, "We were spies in the quietest war." He paused, then added, "And we won by never being seen." It wasn't victory. It was endurance, the last and only language the sea understood.